Hi, my name is Scott Love, and I'm going to be walking through the extremely helpful book of the Bible, 1 Corinthians. And 20 years ago, if I would have studied this book and kind of gave a recap, I would have said the things that Paul is having to address are just absolutely and crazy and unimaginable. But unfortunately, I believe that this letter could be written to the Church of America with a lot of the issues that are covered today. So the Apostle Paul is the author, and he cares deeply about this church after spending over a year investing and pouring his life into it. Corinth is a major port city that offers a shortcut to deliver goods and move ships by land from one sea to another. And so this made it a melting pot for culture and nearly every kind of worship to other gods. And I think we can compare what social media influence has done to our modern world in opening a floodgate of opinions, teachings, and practices up to our current generation. There was a lot of confusion for these believers who were coming out of the worship of false gods in Corinth, and they needed to be renewed and transformed from all of the wrong theology and practices. So Paul leaves and he goes to invest in some other areas and some other churches, and he gets word that Corinth has gone wild. He has then to address a number of issues and questions that come to him from the church of Corinth. And there are really five categories of problems that Paul needs to address, and his response to these issues make up the first letter of to the Corinthians, along with a final greeting. So the problem is brought to the surface, and then Paul points back to the gospel to bring clarity on why it's a problem and how it needs to be addressed. So in chapters 1 through 4, there are divisions in the church. The church is arguing over different servant leaders and teachers that have come to them, such as Apollos and Peter and Paul, and they're fighting over who's better and who needs to be the one they follow. And Paul points them back to Jesus, and he just reiterates how ridiculous it is to pick sides over a teacher preference. Unfortunately, I have experienced the same dynamic in the church today, as many will pay more allegiance to a church organization and to individual teachers and preachers than to Jesus himself, and they'll write others off because they're not following the same leader. And so if there's a fall in leadership or there's a church that crumbles, oftentimes those believers struggle along with it. Chapters 5 through 7, Paul has to deal with some crazy issues that have developed around sex. The idea that God's grace somehow sets them free from any responsibility or consequence to what they do with their bodies. It's opened them up to all kinds of destructive sexual practices. There's a guy sleeping with his stepmom. Some are practicing prostitution at temples and the worship of other gods there. And in many in the church, they don't seem to have a problem with this. It almost seems accepted. And so, again, 20 years ago, this would have seemed shocking, but today, the standard for sexual practice in the church in America seems to be no different than those outside the church. Paul's response is that what we do with our bodies matters to Jesus, and he lays down the truth that sexual integrity is walking in freedom and not being again enslaved to sexual immorality. In chapters 8 through 10, Paul deals with the issues of what they eat. The culture offered sacrifice to Greek and Roman gods in the temples, and often the best deals on meat in the market would have been leftovers from some of these ceremonies. And so Paul says it's just meat. We don't need to see it as more than that as Christians, although some were involved in the past in these sacrifices and they feel it violates their conscience to eat meat used to worship demons. So Paul concludes, follow your conscience, but if it's going to hurt and be a stumbling block to your brother, then don't eat it with them. Love is the guide and love is the gospel. So if you care more about your stomach than your brother's spiritual life, then you're not walking in love. Chapters 11 through 14, Paul's addressing problems in their worship gatherings, and the gatherings seem to be in utter chaos. Believers are speaking in tongues over each other. They're giving teachings. They're cutting each other off, and it's not beneficial. It's out of order. And he connects these gifts that the Holy Spirit gives with chapter 13 and brings it together back to love. Love is the goal. The gifts can be an avenue for God's love to be expressed, but make the main thing the main thing. And we all need to do this in an orderly fashion. And so finally in chapter 15, Paul deals with the resurrection. Many were saying the resurrection doesn't matter, and Paul comes back and emphasizes, saying the resurrection does matter. It's key. It's our foundation for hope. Hope is what gives us the motivation to live pure, to love people. It puts the backbone into the victory and the power of the believer in the church on the earth. And so the resurrection from the dead is our core hope. And this too is crucial today as the world is becoming more and more chaotic and hopelessness seems to be abounding. We stand in our confident hope that as Christ was resurrected, we too will be. And so this is a powerful letter that was directed to the Church of Corinth, but I do believe that we can glean so much that that is so important today as we stand to be the church and to express Jesus in the earth.